There are terrible moments when I realize how much like my parents I am becoming. We have a 4-year-old daughter, Clara, and there'll be moments where I'm attempting to communicate to Clara to just impart some important information that she needs for her life, like, hey, you need to go potty before we leave, or hey, you've got about 5 minutes left to play until it's time for dinner. And I'll share these things with Clara, expecting a response, and yet she just continues to stare off into space, avoid eye contact with me, or just keep playing with her toys. And these interactions usually end in one of two ways. The first way is that I get frustrated and I walk away and Clara does not do what I've asked her to do. Or the second way it ends is that Clara gets frustrated, says, okay, all sassy pants, and then doesn't do what I've asked her to do. So if my parents are watching this, I apologize. So that's what life is like with a toddler. And sometimes I think that we're all a little bit like that. We're a little hard of hearing. We don't necessarily hear very well when it comes to what Jesus asks of us. And this morning, or today, whenever you're watching this, we're going to see that in our passage, which comes from Mark chapter 7. Let's look at what God's word has to say. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There, some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. And so at this point in Jesus' ministry, he's hanging out outside of the nation of Israel. He's hanging out with Gentile people. And Gentile simply means somebody who isn't Jewish. And so some people bring Jesus this man who is deaf and he cannot speak very well. And there's a good chance that this man wasn't born deaf, that he at some point could hear. That's why he was able to speak. But when he went deaf and then something happened with his mouth, he could no longer speak as well. And think about how challenging that would be. To have understanding, to be able to communicate, and to have that completely taken away from you. Not only to be able to hear what people are saying, but then to lose your ability to communicate yourself. That must have been so frustrating for this man, this blind man. And I'm sure that these Gentiles, even though they weren't from the nation of Israel, they weren't Jewish, they'd heard stories of Jesus healing people. In fact, in the devotion from yesterday, Pastor Brad shared the story about Jesus being on this side of the Sea of Galilee, hanging out with Gentiles, and he heals a woman's daughter who has an impure spirit. So they know about Jesus. And so Jesus takes this man aside, and he does something weird. He sticks his fingers sticks his fingers in the man's ear, and then spits on his hand, and then touches the man's tongue, and then says, "Be opened up," Ephphatha, that word. And the man is healed. And he can hear and he can speak. And it's this great thing. And we sometimes wonder, like, why did Jesus do it this way? I mean, Jesus didn't have to go, he didn't have to spit on his fingers or touch the man's tongue. Like, Jesus didn't have to do any of that. But he just chose to do it. Like, Jesus could have thought a word. Jesus could have said a word. Jesus could have done a little dance. Like, Jesus could have done whatever he wanted to heal this man. Yet in this instance, because it's Jesus' prerogative, he chose to heal the man like this. And so Jesus tells this man and his friends, don't tell anybody about what has happened. But if I hadn't been able to hear, and if I hadn't been able to speak, you could not have stopped me from telling everybody about what had happened to me. And so I think for us, there are two takeaways from this passage this morning. First is that Jesus is outside of the nation of Israel. He's on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He's in the Decapolis, which are these 10 cities that aren't Jewish, and Jesus is still healing. Jesus is still working. Jesus is still valuing people. So Jesus is a king for all people, not just the Jewish people, which is great for me because I'm not Jewish. I'm German, I'm Swedish, and I'm Japanese. So if Jesus weren't a king for all people, if Jesus were just a king for Jewish people, then he wouldn't be able to be my king. But Jesus is a king for all people. Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise that God had given to Abraham, that all people in the world be blessed through Abraham's line. So Jesus is a king for all people, and that encourages us. But you know what? It probably also challenges us, because it makes us think that, well, if Jesus is a king for all people, then he's a king for people who don't look like me. He's a king for people who don't act like me. He's a king for people who even don't vote like me. Like he's a king for all people. And so we can't be like my son, who just gets angry when somebody takes his toy, says, it's my toy. He's not our Jesus. He's a Jesus for all people. He's a king for all people. So that's the first takeaway, I think. The second takeaway we have in this story is that far too often, I think we're like this deaf man. We don't hear what Jesus is telling us. Not because there's something wrong with our ears, but because there's something wrong with our hearts. Jesus tells us the best way to live our life. Jesus tells us what we should do with our lives, and sometimes we don't listen. Too often we hear what Jesus has to say and we just ignore it. We go and do our own thing. And we know that Jesus wants to speak into every single area of our lives, but maybe we have selective listening. We listen to Jesus in one part of our lives, but we ignore him in another. Maybe Jesus' challenge from Rob's sermon last week to care about our interior lives and not so much the exterior. Maybe that challenges us. Maybe that challenges you because you're so focused on what people can see either in real life or through curating your social media life. Maybe Jesus' challenge to cut out our eye if it causes us to sin and lust. Maybe that's something you don't want to listen to. You want to go to the websites you go to. You want to think about the things that you think about. Maybe Jesus' challenge not to worry is a bit too much, and you don't want to listen to that because the more you worry, the more in your head that you plan, the more contingencies and possibilities for what you plan, that means that you can still cling to the illusory dream of control. That might be what I struggle with. So we listen to Jesus sometimes, but a lot of times we're like that deaf man and we don't listen. A lot of times we're like my 4-year-old daughter, Clara, who just does not listen to what I had to say. But what I'm saying to Clara, I'm trying to impart information to her. What Jesus is telling us, these are the very words of life. The things that Jesus tells us, the ways that he tells us to live life, like that will give us the best life possible. The things that Jesus tells us will give us full life. Yet we still choose not to listen. Again, not because of broken ears, but because of broken hearts. I think one of the best ways that we can work on fixing our hearts and being more like the people that God created us to be is actually just by listening to Jesus. And so what's one thing today, one way that you know Jesus is talking to you? One way that Jesus is asking you to live? What is one way just today? One way, one time even, that you can do what Jesus is asking you to do? For me, it is that bit about not worrying. Because if you weren't aware, there's so much that goes into getting our online service together, and I plan, and I have contingencies upon contingencies upon contingencies. I just lay in bed and I think, well, if this goes wrong, I can do this, and if this goes wrong, I can do this, and this goes wrong, I can do this. Because I want to be in control. But Jesus says, don't worry. Trust me. So can I listen to Jesus a little bit better this week in what he's asking me to do? Can you listen to Jesus a little bit better this week, what he's asking you to do? Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really grateful. We're really happy for this opportunity just to encourage you on a daily basis with some devotionals and some Bible reading. If you're watching this on Thursday, September 24th, and it's not the evening yet, you still have time to join us for our CBC Family Reunion. If you're interested in signing up for that, just go to findcommunity.com/reunion, and we'll be able to see each other face-to-face over Zoom, have some conversations, and have some fun. Really looking forward to that. Have a great, great day, and we look forward to worshiping together with you this weekend. Bye.